This is Lovejoy Street, goes back and forth, and at this particular spot, it transitions and becomes Cornell Road. Cornell Road, which begins climbing this direction and starts climbing you up into the West Hills up here. So I'm gonna walk up there today, tell you a story of something very strange, something definitely unsolved. A discovery made right up the road up into the hills back in 1920. So I'm here walking in up into the West Hills, just outside of downtown Portland in Oregon. And yet I'm going to tell you the story about a guy who spent almost his whole life living in Vermont. It's a guy named Fred Braley. He was born, well, I mean, depending on what resources you look at, there's a different date given for him. Paperwork says he was born in 1870, other stuff says 1884. There's a lot of mix-up about exactly how old the guy was, but in 1918, this guy's doing pretty well for himself. He's got a pretty nice house in this small Vermont town that he lives in. The house is still there to this day. It's interesting, he had a really big house, but as far as I can tell, he was like a bachelor his whole life. And he's got this nice cushiony vice president position at the People's National Bank in his town. So this guy's doing good. He does not have a care, and you'd assume not a complaint in the world, but it seems like being the vice president of a bank was not exactly the exciting life that he wanted for himself, or at least at some point it became that. Come December 1918, this guy shocks and surprises everybody by suddenly resigning from his position. He's got this great job and he resigns, and he pretty much says, hey, listen, I've done this gig, I've done it well, I've done it for a long time, and I'm ready for something else. And he tells everybody, yeah, I'm gonna go see. He's a little cryptic about it, but like, I'm gonna go, see the rest of the country, and I'm going to pursue something new. I mean, people are like, wow, okay. I mean, well, we can't do anything to stop you, but this shocked a lot of people in his community. And before the year is out, mind you, it's already December. Before the year is out, he leaves Vermont and heads to the West Coast. He told people he was headed for California, and there's evidence that he settled in San Francisco for a while. And once he arrived there, he signed up with an employment agency, obviously trying to figure out what his next step in life is going to be. And it's just so interesting. I mean, kudos to the guy for just wanting something fresh, even if it was really a risk, because he leaves this cushiony bank job, goes out west, a part of the country he doesn't know very well. And he obviously doesn't have everything sorted out, because the first thing he does is he signs up with an employment agency, like, hey, I just rolled into town. Can one of you get me a job? Awesome. So Fred Braley's out west, and there's reason to believe his primary motive in leaving wasn't just to start something new or, live like the poor people and just see what happens after living such a cushiony life for so long. It seems like he wanted to get involved in investing, which, I mean, makes sense. The guy has a banking background. He definitely had some money to him when he left town, so he probably had some money to invest. And he did invest a lot in stocks for various businesses, various things that he probably thought at some point or another were going to yield him a pretty significant return. He probably figured going this way, he's gonna make more money than he ever did working at this tiny rinky-dink bank in Vermont. And it's interesting because there's no solid indication that he was super successful in doing this, or on the flip side, an abysmal failure. There's no real indication how well he did. It seems like he probably didn't really do all that great, but it's thought that that may have been one of the reasons he all of a sudden just uprooted and changed his life. And whatever the case, at some point or another, he leaves California and he ends up in Portland. And that is what brings us to the hills that I'm climbing along Cornell Road here. Cornell Road plays a pretty significant role in this, at least it's close to the focal mystery in this whole story. And there's always been some houses out here, but there used to be a lot fewer. And, you know, you think you're going up into the hills. It's a very, very dark place at night. I mean, it is nowadays. Further up the road you go. And it can be quite mysterious. One of the, perhaps, most interesting stories, not just related to Cornell Road, but to Portland mysteries that happened somewhere along this stretch I'm walking into, was a guy named Alex Huber was shot and killed in the dark of night right up here. Just his body was left there to be found later. It's never been officially solved. However, the lingering theory is bizarre. So it goes. So I shouldn't laugh about a man's murder, but so this guy, Alex Huber, he's a local milkman. Works for this business in town, and he delivers the milk. And one night, it's thought that this was directly involved in his murder. Only a couple days before he's killed, he is out at a bar down by the waterfront near like First and Yamhill, or Front and Yamhill streets. And he's there with some of his coworkers, fellow milkmen, tying one off at the end of the day. And it just so happens that there's like a group of guys from like a rival milk company. And they're probably getting a little drunk. And all of a sudden this brawl breaks out. All these milkmen start just fist fighting. And one of the guys for the rival milk company from the one that Alex Huber worked for was a guy named John Liu. And of all the guys in this fight, John Liu gets just eviscerated. He gets the hell beat out of him. And it seems in the aftermath, this guy was so ashamed by how poorly he'd fought. You know, this was 1907, by the way. You know, back then, if you were a man and you lost a fight, that was shameful. And apparently this guy got horribly despondent and depressed in the aftermath of this. He's all beat to shit anyway. And it's thought that he may have been so overwhelmed by what happened, and maybe Alex Huber's the one that beat him the most, that he decided to seek revenge. Figured out where Huber would be, or at least knew where he'd live and where he'd be walking, and potentially just picked him off. Like, this particular stretch is pretty close to where Huber was found shot, and I saw someone could easily hid in the brush over here and just picked him off right here, and then fled the scene. And oh, hello. To make himself look a little more suspicious, John Liu all of a sudden disappears after Alex Huber turns up dead, and he's been talked to a little by the police. They're kind of looking at him, and he just disappears, and he's missing for a while. And he's ultimately found in a small community called New Era, south of Oregon City, like many miles off that way. And he had gone into the woods there. It's kind of a rural area, and he hung himself. And people thought that he probably did that out of guilt or out of knowing that he'd eventually be caught and he'd probably be executed for a murder anyway. And that brings us to the first of a couple tunnels where Cornell Road cuts through the hillside. It's June 27th, 1920. It's about a year and a half since Fred Braley left Vermont, came to the West Coast. And there's a guy named Ben Bechtel who ran a local drugstore in town, and he was a nature enthusiast. He liked to get out and walk around. And of course, this is where lower Macleay Park down there hooks into like regular Macleay Park through here. So if you're an adventurer, this is a place you'd go. And Mr. Bechtel engages in the type of exploration that few dare attempt. Now, I know that the Wildwood Trail, a trail that I explored a couple summers ago and didn't really plan out that well, it's just a little ways down there, up and around the corner from the tunnel here. Now, I don't think that trail specifically, at least by its name, was around back in 1920, but there were some trails through here. Macleay Park had been well established by that point. In fact, it was established before 1900. So there were some trails here. But Ben Bechtel didn't just want to wander the same trails as everyone else. He wanted true adventure. So if I had to approximate exactly where he was in relation to where the trail that led through here most likely came out, which is probably still in the vicinity of the Wildwood Trail, if not right there. Bechtel didn't want to walk the same trail as everybody else did. He wanted to blaze his own trail, literally. And so a short distance before you get to the main trail, which again I would guess is right up here, past the tunnel, he turns and he just starts climbing up, something sort of like this, probably not quite this steep, but he starts just climbing through the trees and the brush on his own. He's a real nature guy, an adventurer. I respect the hell out of the guy for wanting to do that. And on this particular day, June 27th, 1920, he's climbing, and you're climbing steep ground, so you're digging your feet in to kind of make sure that you're gonna, hold firm and not tumble down to the ground below. And as he's climbing up, again, probably pretty close to this area that I'm in now, his foot slips into a hole where the land was kind of weak. And as he, looks down, his, foot is slipped into a hole. He pulls his foot back and he can see that there's an actual open space under there. And Ben Bechtel is a little bit concerned. He's an adventurer, but something about this rang strange to him. Why is there, on the steep hillside, why is there this random hole? It was big enough that he could tell somebody had dug a space in there. And as a guy that knew the perils of climbing this kind of stuff, he immediately assumed whoever did this probably had to have help. But in that moment, he decides to not investigate it for himself. And later on, the implication is he was concerned there would be a body or maybe some bones down in there. He thought maybe a body had been buried up. And it makes sense because this is incredibly difficult terrain to walk. If you bury a body up here, assuming an animal doesn't get to it, it's very unlikely that someone's gonna find it. And it's like 1,000,000 to 1 story. There's all of this space up into the hills here and there that practically no one traverses. And this guy is walking through this vast area. and he happens to step right onto this one area where a hole had been dug to unveil this hole. The odds of him hitting that exact spot is so microscopic. But either way, he leaves the scene. Not really knowing what he's dealing with here, Ben Bechtel comes back later with a friend by the name of Charles Minor. And I only remember that his friend was named Charles Minor because I've watched a lot of The Office. If you don't get that reference, then I'm sorry. So he comes back later with his friend Charles Minor. And this is, he officially wants to, like, check it out. But he wants a witness close by. He doesn't want to be the only guy randomly. Because, I mean, think about it. You say, like, oh, I just like climbing up treacherous hills and kind of putting myself in danger. And, oh, I stumbled onto a hole that maybe has a body in it. I mean, if he ran down to the police station to tell them that story, do you think they would have believed him? I kind of have a feeling they wouldn't have. So this guy was just trying to be safe about things. So it's been about a week, June 28th. These two men come back out to scour the hillside. Being a worldly traveler, Bechtel made sure to put a marker there so they know exactly where to find this hole. And on this return to the site, they actually look down into the hole and they discover that there's 2 jars that are just full of random items. So they're able to, breathe a sigh of relief. At least there's not a body buried down here. But it's interesting. Now, the issue is they just came out here to check on this stuff. They didn't come out here necessarily to grab anything. Again, if there's a body in there, they're not going to be like digging it out. They're going to go let the authorities know, probably. And so they see like, okay, nobody's dead. So they decide, okay, let's do this on our own. Let's dig this place up. So they come back 2 days later, June 30th, with actual, stuff there that they can use to, dig and pull these jars out and remove them. And there are so many random things in these jars, including those are probably the least intriguing items, at least as far as I'm concerned. What's of most interest is there's a bunch of documentation left in these jars. There's old documentation related to Braley's past working for the bank. There's a bunch of documentation for the stocks that he tried to buy, which dated back to like October 1918, so a couple months before he quit his job at the bank. So again, there's kind of an inference. Was his main motivation for leaving the bank that he was trying to pursue this investment life? And there's a bunch of, this is really interesting, there was a bunch of blank checks from the bank he'd worked at. They all had his signature on them. The fact that all the checks had signatures on them and they examined them and found all the signatures were identical, like they'd almost been just stamped on, made people wonder, at least in terms of like, why would this happen? Some people wondered if maybe he'd been forced to sign a bunch of them. Again, by force, by somebody who was going to maybe try to use those checks later on or something. I mean, passing bad checks way back then, that was as common as shoplifting now, because you could get away with it a lot easier back then. People passed fake checks left and right. So if Braley had encountered the wrong person, and he lets him know that he's this former bank guy and he's got checks on him, and you could force him to sign all these checks, and they're blank checks for you. But even if that's what happened, why does it end up just buried up on this hillside, and these checks are just sitting there going unused? And while the earth was kind of unstable and Bechtel was able to fall into the hole pretty quick, it still seemed, you know, like this stuff had probably been buried here for a while. But the most, I guess, gripping thing to people, and this was the thing that got headlines in local newspapers, was dated way back in 1908. Fred Braley's will was folded up and tucked into one of these jars as well. So all of this important stuff, to Fred Braley in particular, is stuffed in these jars and buried up on this hillside. So these two guys, you know, pull these jars out, and they run them down Cornell Road all the way into downtown to the Henry Building, right in the heart of downtown, where they had a lawyer acquaintance, and they brought it to this individual. And this pissed the police off, because the police were like, why didn't you call us the moment you found the hole? Why didn't you call us when you saw what was in there? Why didn't you turn this evidence over to us? Why did you take it to this lawyer instead? And the funny thing is, in the end, the police didn't even really investigate the thing, because the police around here had no clue who Fred Braley was, where he was, what he had done, why he had done this, or if he was even the one that was responsible for doing this. So they got real pissed at first because these guys didn't bring them the evidence right away. But then in the long run, they didn't care to investigate it anyway. So the issue here, once all this stuff is found, then becomes, what the hell happened to Fred Braley? So a friend of Fred's says, kind of around the end of January 1919, so he hasn't been gone from Vermont for very long, that they had an encounter and they met each other in Salt Lake City, Utah, of all places. But he wasn't really 100% certain on the date, and the last verified confirmation that Fred Braley was alive was a letter that he sent back home to Vermont, dated January 21st, 1919. And that was the last anybody back home had heard of him. So by the summer of 1920, people around Portland, they have no idea that this guy's been missing for a long time. He's been reported missing, and nobody's known for over a year where Fred Braley was. But the thing is, and again, maybe the police around here were notified and just were like, oh yeah, we'll keep our eyes open. But in this letter from January, the last he's heard from, he tells people he's leaving San Francisco and he's heading up to Portland. So you'd think, with him being missing as long as he had been, one of the first things they would do would be contact authorities in San Francisco and Portland, and perhaps some of the places in between. Maybe something happened to Fred between here and there, and let them know, hey, like, there's this guy, and all of a sudden he's incommunicado, and it's been months, and now it's like over a year going into 1920, and nobody's heard from this guy. And now all of a sudden his goods are found out here on a hillside in Macleay Park, just kind of northwest of downtown Portland. So this is very strange, and it's very bizarre, and it lends itself to numerous theories. The one that got landed on pretty quickly was that Fred probably just, I don't know, maybe he didn't trust a lot of people. Maybe these things were really important to him, and he wanted to put this stuff somewhere where he assumed, I mean, I would as well, you'd think that would be a safe spot to put some stuff. No one would ever find it. He goes up there, probably with a colleague, and buries his stuff out there for safekeeping. The alternative theory is someone got to him, someone that knew maybe he had some money, maybe they knew they could get something off of him. Robberies in Portland during the earlier part of the 20th century were constant. So the other idea is that he either was forced to do this by someone and then eliminated, or perhaps somebody did something, took care of him, killed him, whatever, and then got that stuff, put it in some stuff, and then they hid it up here. that seems kind of odd that somebody that steals his stuff would go to all this work to put it up here. And also, like, it seems again like this stuff had been there for a very long time. So like, whoever did this, don't you think they would like come back and access it and use some of the stuff? I don't know. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. So those are the two lingering theories. He did it, or someone else made him do it, or got to his stuff and took it away from him. So another theory kind of put forward by some people that I didn't really take any time to talk about, because it just seemed to kind of pop up here and there. It didn't really seem like anybody really seriously believed it. This guy was from a good home. He was stable. But it could have happened, which that is the idea, that he came to Portland and then shuffled himself off this mortal coil, if you know what I mean. And so he buried all this stuff hidden in the hills and then finished himself off. And like other possibilities, why would he obviously wanted to save this stuff. Why would he just bury it in a hillside, apparently not tell anybody about it, so it's unlikely to ever be found, and then he just goes away? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Some people tried to suggest that, a couple people that knew him. Again, some people that may have reason to be annoyed with him because he just kind of split from Vermont. But that was something that was put forward. And just when I think about why somebody would do something like that, and maybe he was forced to, but the most logical thing for me is that this guy took all of his stuff, buried it. He wanted to keep it hidden away. He didn't trust a bank. The guy did have a past working for a bank. Maybe he knew that those I forget what they're called, safety deposit boxes. Maybe he knew that maybe things like that aren't as safe as they let you on to believe, which is just so interesting that you think a bank would be a good place to save important documents, papers, money, and stuff, and this guy chooses a random hillside to hide all of his stuff. I don't know, maybe he really did know that banking life, but I feel like the most likely scenario is that he hid it there for whatever reason. Maybe he really did have, we don't know, maybe he had a really solid reason for wanting to hide stuff in a place where it's very unlikely to be found. But it makes the most sense to me that he would ultimately come back for that stuff. He stored it there until he needed it again. That's where I continue to stand on this. Which does kind of lead me to think maybe he died under some set of circumstances shortly after he hit it, because regardless of what happened, he never went back for this stuff. But the overall mystery to that has never been solved. Nobody knows exactly who or exactly why. Any of those questions you can ask. How this stuff just ended up in some jars buried in the hills up here. And this was contemplated, maybe this was Fred Braley. They never did determine that it was him, but on Memorial Day 1920, about 3 weeks before Ben Bechtel makes his discovery up here, there was a body of an unidentified man found floating in the Willamette River back down in town. And it was wondered, could that have been Fred Braley? Obviously, it could have been anybody in the world. But the details of the body did match relatively close to the overall age and appearance of Fred Braley. And the man who was found, he'd been dead for a while. I figured he'd been dead at least 9 months. And of course, Fred Braley could have come here as early as January or February 1919. So that checks out. And the man was also wearing really nice clothes. And Fred Braley, he worked at a bank. He had some money. He probably would have had some pretty nice clothes. And it was deemed this individual had a fractured skull. That was probably what happened. Someone killed him that way and then tossed him into the river at some point. So if it was Fred, that's how he went. But the body was never, as far as I could gather, never officially identified. He'd been in the water a long time. He was probably decomposing. It's a long time ago. They don't have the technology we have today. So we don't know. It could have been, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But what's so interesting about all of this stuff, whether the body found in the river was Fred Braley or not, or whatever, what's so interesting is that aside from this stuff being found up in the hills here, there is no evidence whatsoever that Fred Braley ever came to Portland. He obviously said he was. We have to assume he did because all of his stuff made it up here. Even if someone took his stuff from him and buried it here, what? They took it from him in San Francisco and came way up to Portland and found a hillside to bury it on? Like, you know, I'm one to think like, okay, that's pretty unlikely, but maybe possible. No, in this regard, there's no way that's what happened. So, like, even if he was only here for a little while, he had to have come here, but there was no proof. Every effort possible was done to find out if he had come here and died, see if they had any records of him being found dead in town. They checked on all of these records, anything. There was nothing that showed that he had come here. He even had a relative that lived on the east side of town who lived here. You know, you'd think you live in Vermont most of your life. You've probably never been to Oregon before, and you have a relative that lives right here in Portland. And he didn't even go visit that relative. And like, you'd think under normal circumstances, that would be something you would do at some point. It's just strange. It's like he came here, left his stuff, and then vanished. So, yeah, we don't know. We don't know what happened to Fred Braley. We don't know if he was killed, whether he died here or he left and died somewhere else. He just left his stuff up here and then planned on coming back at some point. That could have been what happened. He could have gone to a whole other place and then died there. And again, you could get away with something like this a little bit easier back in 1920 than you could now. It's almost impossible now. But people he worked with, as well as some family members, they drew the conclusion, some of them pretty quickly after he first went missing, before this discovery was made, they drew the conclusion that he had left his whole life behind entirely, started anew, changed his name, or at least went by another name, and went off and did something else. And he just wanted to leave them all behind. And while I feel like a lot of people just kind of say that when someone goes missing and you haven't officially discovered whether they're dead or not, some people can get, kind of pissed and kind of, like, we were so close, and then he just leaves and doesn't contact us anymore. It's easy to get, like, oh, he probably just changed his identity because he doesn't even care, But that would have been a lot easier to do back in the 1920s, and it does potentially check out with the activities that Fred Braley had engaged in. He gave up this job out of nowhere, split town right after, dives into these new business ventures, goes way out to the West Coast, and then he just kind of disappears. It does kind of sync with the possibility that he could have just said, the hell with this. I'm leaving Fred Braley behind, and I'm starting anew as Calvin Dobson or whatever, I don't know. And he could have lived on quite some time after this under a different name, in a different place. He may have even stayed in Portland. I don't know. It's also theorized that his investment efforts, perhaps they were an abysmal failure. There's not really any evidence to suggest he was very successful, so the alternative is he didn't do that well. And some wonder if maybe he had wiped himself out financially trying to do this stuff. And that would have given him perhaps another reason to want to completely shed his skin of this Fred Braley character he'd been his whole life and to try something new. There was also something else interesting. They said that he was also like an amateur inventor, or at least he tried to be, and he invented this random device. Like, what the hell was this? There was like documentation in the jars for this, that he had gotten a patent on this random thing he invented. An oil saver. He was the inventor of a device called the oil saver. No information found that this invention ever made it to market. So he invented a thing called the oil saver, apparently. that, I don't know, maybe it was like if you use any item that runs on oil, you could use this device and it would make the oil last longer. That actually probably would have been pretty useful back then, but no evidence of that one anywhere. So I don't know. There seems to be some indications that maybe this guy wanted to go off and do a bunch of stuff, and a lot of that didn't quite work out the way he wanted it to. But I mean, a lot of this stuff, this is all theories. What happened to this guy? He just vanished into the dead of night. And, you know, while I was digging and looking for information, pretty quickly this story kind of faded from print. And a good reason for that is the fact that the police didn't really care to investigate it. Again, their attitude was, we have no body, we have no proof that this guy was ever here aside from the jars, but we also have no proof that this guy is dead, so why are we going to spend a bunch of time investigating and trying to find this guy when we have absolutely no clue where he could be? His body could be dead in the forest here. For all we know, Fred Braley buried this stuff, and I mean, jumped off an edge. That you could easily kill yourself just right here, jumping off this edge and falling down there. It is a steep fall. The hills are pretty wild through here. Macleay Park into Forest Park. There's lots of places you could hide something. But yeah, because law enforcement didn't even really want to investigate it, they're like, we don't have any clue what's going on. We're not going to invest our manpower into this. There were no updates. There was nothing to follow up on. Fred Braley was never found. There was nothing further to discuss, so it faded away from print rather quickly. Last reference I found to it was from 1921, at which time Fred Braley was obviously still unaccounted for, and it was thought that it might revive the case a little bit. And it was literally just this random guy in Portland who contacted the small town in Vermont where Braley had lived, asking for further information. It seemed like this guy was maybe, I don't know, an amateur sleuth trying to do his own investigating and wanted some more info. And people for like 5 seconds were like, wait, is there a revival in this case? Are we finally going to figure out where Fred Braley is? But no. I think it was just some guy maybe trying to do his own thing. No evidence the guy was successful. I even tried to look up information on that guy to see if it cross-referenced to any discoveries he made in the Braley case, and there was nothing. This guy stood up and jumped off the face of the earth more than 100 years ago. We have no clue what happened to him. And all we had to remember him by were these couple of jars of stuff he just buried on a hillside. I saw that story. I immediately knew I wanted to cover it, but I also knew I wanted to cover it the way that I used to. For those of you that are newer to my channel, this kind of format is how I used to do all of my videos. Go to the scene, tell the story, reflect on it, have fun, get some exercise while you're at it. And I don't do it as often. I want to do it more. And when I find new stories, I know right on the spot whether it's going to be a documentary type thing like I usually do, or whether it's going to be better served, in my opinion at least, as a story where I should just come out here and bring you the story from the scene. So this story absolutely fit that. I was like, this guy went out into the woods, climbed some hillside, buried some of his stuff up here, and left us with this grand mystery that mystifies the mind. So I was like, well, I mean, if that's not a story that begs for me to come out here and do it on scene, I don't know what is. And that is it from the hills of Macleay Park along the tunnel to Cornell Road in roughly the vicinity where, based on their general description of where Ben Bechtel was, roughly somewhere up in here is where that hole would have been, where all that stuff was buried. So I'm approximating it, but I'm approximating it based on the information that was given, based on side of Cornell that he was on, the close proximate distance to a trail, close to Cornell Road right here, all that stuff. So I'm pretty close. We are talking about a small space in an infinite park. So I want to thank you so much for stopping by. I hope some of you old school fans enjoyed me going out and doing things the way that I used to. Again, I want to do this more often. I do miss doing this, and the weather's only going to slowly get better. It is just February right now, but it is a beautiful February day. All right. So anyway, all that said, I want to thank you guys so much for stopping by, new viewers and old. Hope you enjoyed this little adventure, this little story. And I haven't done this in a long time. If you're new to the channel, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Hit up my Patreon. The link is in the description. And whew, that made me nostalgic. And yeah, all that said, from the hills near Macleay Park along Cornell Road, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian, and I will see you next time.